My father lifted his glass, the golden champagne catching the light. He smiled wide, proud, and glowing and said, "To my brilliant daughter Rachel, the star of this family." Everyone clapped. Glasses clinked. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin as though Rachel had just cured a disease instead of landing another promotion. Rachel sat there soaking it in her diamond earrings, catching the chandelier light like they were designed to blind me. Then Dad added with that familiar smirk that made my stomach twist, "And as for Anna, well, maybe one day she'll surprise us all." Laughter spilled across the table, bouncing off the crystal and silverware, drowning out the sound of my heart breaking. To them it was harmless, a joke, family banter. But to me, it was another reminder that I had never been and would never be Rachel. I pushed back my chair. The legs screeched against the hardwood floor like a scream no one else could hear. Nobody stopped me. Nobody called my name. They just kept laughing, pouring Rachel another drink, raising their glasses higher. I just walked out. It wasn't always like this. Or maybe it always was, and I just didn't notice until the comparisons became impossible to ignore. Rachel was the golden child before she could even spell her own name. At 6 years old, she got a standing ovation at her school play because she remembered all her lines. I was in the same play too, except I tripped over my shoelaces during my one line, and Dad still brings it up like a family joke. When Rachel made honor roll, Mom framed the certificate and hung it in the hallway where every guest could see it. When I brought home my artwork, a sketch I'd worked on for weeks, she patted my head and said, "That's nice, Anna. Now help me polish Rachel's frame." It wasn't just school. Birthdays were unequal wars disguised as celebrations. Rachel's 16th birthday was a grand event with a rented hall, a live band, and a glittering cake taller than me. Mine a small chocolate cake at the kitchen table, candles leaning like they were tired my parents, barely looking up from their phones. Rachel got a car wrapped in a red bow. I got a sweater 2 sizes too big. Even the smallest things carried the weight of favoritism. When Rachel wanted pancakes, Dad flipped them golden brown with a smile. When I asked, he sighed and muttered, "Cereal is quicker, Anna." I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that one day I'd do something so undeniable that they'd finally look at me the way they looked at her. I imagined Dad lifting his glass to me, Mom crying happy tears, Rachel clapping like she meant it. But that day never came. Instead, every achievement of mine was measured against Rachel's, and every time I fell short, the gap between us widened into a canyon I could never cross. And the cruelest part, I loved her once. I adored my big sister. When I was little, I'd sneak into her room just to watch her brush her hair, convinced she was a princess, and I was lucky just to live in the same castle. But castles have shadows, and I was the one left standing in them. So when Dad made that toast, when he chose yet again to crown Rachel and turn me into the family's punchline, something inside me snapped. That moment at the dinner table wasn't just humiliation, it was the echo of every slight, every joke, every dismissal stacked on top of me until I could barely breathe. That's when I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep sitting at that table swallowing their laughter like poison. Something had to change, and deep down, for the first time, I felt the faintest flicker of a plan forming. I wish I could say, the night of that toast was the only time my family humiliated me in front of others. But the truth, it was just the last straw, the moment my silence finally cracked. After I stormed out of the dining room, I sat in my car, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The snowflakes tapped against the windshield like impatient fingers, daring me to drive away. I wanted to scream, to pound the horn until the sound swallowed the entire neighborhood. But I didn't. I sat there frozen, the engine cold, my mind racing through every slight that had piled up until the weight became unbearable. Rachel's voice echoed in my head. Anna's just different. She always said it with a smile like she was being kind, but everyone knew what it meant. Different was their polite way of saying lesser, disposable, forgettable. That night, something shifted. For years, I had been the peacekeeper, the one who let their words roll off my back because I told myself family was family and love was unconditional. But unconditional love should never feel like chains, and I was done dragging those chains behind me. The days that followed were quiet, but inside me a storm gathered. I stopped cooking pancakes on Sundays, the ritual I had clung to for so long in hopes of winning Dad's approval. I stopped calling Rachel to check in, something I used to do even when she never called me first. I stopped waiting for Mom's texts that always read Rachel's update, but never ever asked about me. Instead, I started packing, not with suitcases and boxes, but with decisions, little ones at first. I withdrew the last bit of savings I had tucked away in a hidden account money I'd been squirreling away from side gigs no one knew about. I changed the password on my laptop. I quietly moved my personal documents, birth certificate, bank statements, the deed to the small apartment I had bought with my own money into a locked drawer. It was subtle, invisible. If you looked at me from the outside, I was the same Anna who showed up to family dinners and smiled politely. But inside, I was building an escape hatch, brick by brick. The real breaking point, though, came one morning when Mom called me. Her voice was sweet, almost syrupy. "Anna, darling," she said, "could you come by and help us plan Rachel's engagement party? She's so busy, and you've always been good with details." I almost laughed. Always good with details, that was code for doing the grunt work while Rachel shined. I glanced at my calendar, which was already packed with deadlines from the project I'd been quietly working on for months, something no one in my family cared enough to ask about. "Sorry, Mom," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I can't. I have my own commitments." There was a pause, as if the world itself had tilted. Mom cleared her throat, confused. "Your own commitments. What could be more important than your sister's big day?" And in that moment, the truth crystallized inside me, everything. My own commitments, my own dreams, my own worth. All of it mattered more than a lifetime of playing second fiddle. I hung up the phone and felt an eerie calm wash over me. That was it. The spell was broken. I no longer belonged to their stage, their script, their endless cycle of Rachel's triumphs and my silence. That night, I pulled an old box from the top of my closet. Inside were relics of my forgotten efforts, a science fair ribbon folded in half a small trophy from a debate competition, a short story I had written that once won a local contest. None of it had ever made it to the family hallway wall. They had been collecting dust for years, hidden away like secrets. I touched each one, like they were wounds, and then like they were weapons. Because they were proof that I had always been enough even when they refused to see it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't dreaming of their recognition anymore. I was dreaming of my own freedom. That was my breaking point. I didn't announce it. I didn't stage a dramatic showdown. But the vow I made that night was louder than any scream could have been. I would walk away, and this time I would not look back. Silence can be sharper than any scream. After that phone call with my mother, I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my worth in conversations where I was already guilty for simply existing. Instead, I turned inward, building my own life like a fortress brick by brick, invisible to them, but solid enough to withstand every insult they had ever thrown my way. The first step was money. For years, I had been freelancing in the shadows, small design jobs, consulting projects, odd contracts that paid modestly but consistently. While Rachel flaunted her corporate salary and the luxury handbags to match, I was quietly saving every spare dollar. My family thought I lived paycheck to paycheck. They thought I was barely scraping by, and I let them believe it. Because invisibility had its perks, it kept them from looking too closely. But behind that curtain, I had already bought a small apartment in my name. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine, free of their fingerprints. I started renovating it on weekends, painting the walls myself, fixing leaky faucets, teaching myself how to install shelves. Each nail I hammered into the wall felt like staking a claim on my independence. The second step was protection. My father always liked to remind us that the family business, the rental properties passed down from his father, would be Rachel's responsibility one day. He never even entertained the possibility that I might want to share, though legally, I was just as entitled. So I went to the county clerk's office one afternoon on my lunch break. I pulled property records, copied documents, learned the laws he assumed I would never care enough to read. I discovered loopholes, rights, and even assets my parents didn't know I knew about. Knowledge became my weapon, and with every page I photocopied, I felt my spine straighten a little more. The third step was distance. I still showed up to family gatherings, but I was no longer their servant. When Mom asked me to set the table, I politely refused. When Dad made a snide remark about my career, I smiled faintly and sipped my drink instead of defending myself. When Rachel bragged about her latest promotion, I clapped lightly and then pulled out my phone, scrolling with deliberate boredom. These small rebellions confused them. My silence unnerved them. For the first time, they had no script for me. One evening, Rachel called me out of the blue. Her tone was honey dripping with false warmth. "Anna, I've been thinking, maybe you could help me with some spreadsheets for the engagement party budget. You're so organized." I almost laughed. So organized, that was her way of saying I could do the grunt work while she basked in the spotlight. But I had already been pouring my organization into something else, a quiet proposal for a tech startup I'd been nurturing with a small group of colleagues. The documents were spread out on my desk, ready for a pitch meeting that could change everything. "Sorry, Rachel," I said softly. "I'm busy with my own projects." There was silence on the line, followed by a faint edge creeping into her voice. "Your own projects." As if the idea was absurd, as if I had no right to dream outside her shadow. "Yes," I said, smiling, even though she couldn't see it. "Mine." And that word "mine" felt like the sweetest counterattack. Every day my silence grew heavier, but it wasn't empty. It was full of intent. I knew they expected me to come crawling back to beg for scraps of recognition, to prove once again that I could be useful to Rachel's story. But this time, I gave them nothing. Instead, I gave myself everything. Late nights at my desk, eyes burning, fueled by coffee and stubbornness, I wrote proposals, polished designs, made calls. While Rachel was celebrated at galas and family dinners, I was building something they couldn't take away from me. And slowly I could sense the shift. My absence started to show. Mom texted less, almost confused by my lack of availability. Dad's jokes about me grew sharper, more frequent, like he was trying to provoke a reaction. Rachel left me a string of voicemails that went from sweet to irritated to borderline angry. They didn't know it yet, but the balance of power was tilting. My silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Every move I made, every secret I kept was another thread in a web they couldn't see until it was too late. And I knew the day was coming when all of it, all the documents, the savings, the independence would collide with their world. That day, I wouldn't have to scream or fight or beg. I would simply stand, and the silence would speak for me. The first time I refused to sign one of Evelyn's papers, she didn't even try to hide her rage. She stormed into my apartment, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're ungrateful, Nora. Do you have any idea how much I've done for this family? While you, sat in hospital beds and wrote in journals?" Her words stung, but I stood my ground. For once, I didn't apologize. "I won't let you sell what's mine. Not this time." Her eyes narrowed, lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think you can fight me? You don't even know the half of what I control." It was then I realized she wasn't bluffing. Evelyn had quietly inserted herself into every corner of my life. Insurance policies, business registrations, even mail forwarding. She had been preparing for this war long before I woke up from surgery. The days that followed felt like a chess match, except she had queens and rooks while I held only pawns. When I went to the bank, I discovered that my access to several accounts had been temporarily suspended due to signature discrepancies. Evelyn had clearly orchestrated it. When I spoke to contractors who once worked under me, they hesitated, glancing around before whispering, "Your sister warned us not to get involved." Even my own aunt, who used to bring me soup when I was bedridden, avoided my calls. Evelyn had poisoned her with stories of me being unstable and financially reckless. The injustice of it gnawed at me. Evelyn strutted through life like a queen draped in silk, her laughter echoing at dinner parties she never invited me to. Meanwhile, I was the shadow sister, the one who was forgotten, dismissed, underestimated. But power struggles are never one-sided. If Evelyn thought I'd crumble quietly, she underestimated me. I began gathering evidence, small scraps of paper, copies of emails, even overheard conversations from mutual acquaintances. Each detail painted a picture of how deeply she had manipulated not just me, but everyone around us. Late at night, I'd sit at my kitchen table, papers spread out like battle maps. I traced timelines, circled inconsistencies, and highlighted proof of her lies. For the first time in years, my mind felt sharper than hers. I also learned the value of silence. I didn't confront her openly anymore. Instead, I let her believe she had won. When she mocked me at family gatherings, I smiled faintly. When she bragged about her latest property acquisition, I only nodded. Inside, however, I was building something stronger than rage. I was building strategy. The turning point came during a charity gala Evelyn hosted. She looked radiant under the chandeliers, wrapped in emerald silk, dripping with jewels she had likely purchased, using funds siphoned from my accounts. People applauded her speech about family values and resilience, words so hollow they echoed in my ears like mockery. I stood at the back of the room, unnoticed, watching her bask in admiration. I thought of the years I had been invisible, the sacrifices I made in silence, and the endless ways she twisted my weakness into her power. And then quietly, I smiled. Because what Evelyn didn't know was that I had already filed a legal motion. My lawyer had advised discretion, and I followed it to the letter. Tonight, while she reveled in her false crown, wheels of justice were beginning to turn. The documents I had collected were no longer scraps. They were evidence in the hands of a judge. Evelyn's empire wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Still, the fight wasn't without cost. She sensed a shift, even if she couldn't pinpoint it. Her phone calls grew sharper, her visits more intrusive. "What are you up to, Nora?" she sneered one afternoon, slamming her manicured nails against my table. I met her gaze, calm but unwavering. Maybe I'm learning from the best. For the first time, I saw flickers of doubt in her eyes, a crack in her armor. This was no longer just a sibling rivalry. It was a full-blown power struggle, one that would decide not only who controlled our family's legacy, but who finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready to fight, not with Evelyn's cruelty, but with something far stronger, patience, truth, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that she had underestimated me for the very last time. The morning of the hearing, the city felt unusually still. The streets outside the courthouse glistened with last night's rain, and the air carried the faint, metallic chill of something unfinished, like the pause before a storm. I walked slowly up the courthouse steps, my palms clammy, my breath steady only because I forced it to be. Evelyn was already there. She stood at the top of the stairs, draped in another designer suit, sleek charcoal with a silk scarf knotted at her throat. She looked every inch the queen she believed herself to be. Her smile practiced her poise untouchable. When our eyes met, she tilted her head and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. For years, I had given her the satisfaction of reaction. Not today. The courtroom itself felt colder than I expected, as though justice itself was hesitant to appear. My lawyer spread our documents across the table, neat stacks that looked so small compared to the years of Evelyn's dominance. When the judge entered, Evelyn rose gracefully, her confidence unshaken. She spoke with the charm she always reserved for outsiders about how she had managed our family's properties, how she had carried the weight while her younger sister recovered. The room nodded with her rhythm. Even I felt momentarily drowned under her performance, the same way I always had at family dinners, her voice the melody, and mine the forgotten echo. But then it was my turn. I rose my knees, trembling under my dress, and began to speak, not with eloquence, but with clarity. I laid out the emails, the forged signatures, the transfers disguised as maintenance fees. Piece by piece, the threads of her story began to unravel. The judge's eyes shifted. The gallery murmured. Evelyn's smile faltered. The true revelation, however, wasn't just in the paperwork. It was in the silence that followed when I looked directly at her and said, "For years I believed my only role was to be the weaker one, the sick one, the shadow. You made sure I believed that, but weakness is not the same as worthlessness, and silence does not mean surrender. It wasn't part of the legal strategy." My lawyer even shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I needed it said not for the judge, not for the audience, but for myself. Evelyn's eyes burned her mask, slipping as she snapped, "You wouldn't even be standing here if it weren't for me." The outburst echoed through the chamber. For the first time, the polished image she'd spent years curating cracked in public. The judge's gavel came down, sharply restoring order, but the damage was done. People saw her not as the flawless queen, but as the manipulative sister, desperate to hold on to power. After the session, I stepped outside into the gray light of afternoon. Reporters whispered, cameras flashed. I wasn't the invisible one anymore. But the turning point wasn't victory in the courtroom. It was the moment I realized Evelyn could no longer define me. I no longer needed to beg for scraps of dignity or recognition. The truth spoken aloud had shifted the balance. That night back in my apartment, I sat by the window overlooking the city lights. For the first time in years, I wasn't consumed by the weight of injustice. Yes, the legal battle would continue. Yes, Evelyn would scheme again. But I had crossed a threshold she could never drag me back from. I had found my voice. And though the war wasn't over, the tide had turned. Evelyn wasn't untouchable anymore. Neither was I invisible. The verdict came weeks later, but in truth, the turning point had already passed. Still, the official words carried weight. The court recognized Evelyn's manipulations and froze her control over several accounts. The properties she tried to claim were placed under review. It wasn't a complete victory. Evelyn was too skilled, too deeply rooted in the cracks of the system to be dismantled overnight. But for the first time, I stood on level ground. No longer the sister with empty hands, no longer the shadow. When the judge's words were read, Evelyn sat stiff and silent, her painted lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flicked toward me with venom, but behind the venom I saw something I never thought I'd witness fear. The family dinners were never the same after that. Relatives who once listened to Evelyn's stories with unblinking loyalty now eyed her with suspicion. Whispers floated at the edges of the table. Who else had she deceived? Who else had she used? Aunt Clara, who had ignored my calls for months, approached me one evening as we cleared plates. Her voice trembled. "Nora, I should have believed you. I see things differently now." Her apology didn't erase the years of silence, but it mattered. It meant the wall Evelyn built around me was crumbling. Evelyn, however, refused to yield. She still held herself like a queen, laughing too loudly, boasting too often, as though to drown out the cracks spreading beneath her throne. But when she looked at me now, I noticed something new, a flicker of hesitation. She could no longer be certain that I wouldn't answer back. My quiet retaliation had shifted into something stronger presence. I began reclaiming pieces of myself that she had stolen or buried. I reopened old accounts in my name. I called contractors directly speaking with a steady confidence that surprised even me. Slowly, I rebuilt networks Evelyn thought she had permanently burned. And people responded. They listened. They looked at me not as the frail sister to be pitied, but as someone capable, someone they had underestimated. Each step was small, but each step was mine. The last confrontation came not in court, but in Evelyn's living room weeks after the verdict. She'd invited me under the pretense of talking things through, though her eyes glittered with something sharper than reconciliation. She poured herself wine and smirked across the glass. "Enjoy your little victory, Nora, but you'll never have what I have. The influence, the charm, the power to bend people." I set my cup down gently, meeting her gaze. "Maybe not, but I don't need to bend people to stand tall. And you You'll spend the rest of your life guarding a throne that's already sinking." For once, she didn't have a clever retort. She just stared at me, lips parted, searching for words that never came. That silence was my real victory. Months later, I booked a ticket my first solo trip in years. As the plane lifted off the runway, the city shrinking below, I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and let the tears come. Not tears of defeat, not even tears of revenge, but tears of release. Evelyn might still fight, claw, and scheme. She might never change. But I had changed. I was no longer trapped in the role she carved for me, no longer the silent shadow. I carried the scars, yes, but also the proof that I could rise from them. As the clouds swallowed the plane, I thought back to the little girl who once believed her sister's approval was the only measure of worth. I whispered to her softly but firmly, "You were always enough, and now the world will see it too." And with that, I closed my eyes, ready for whatever came next. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or betrayed by the very people who should have stood by you, know this: you're not alone and you're not powerless. Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this journey resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, and stay with me for more stories of strength, survival, and finding your voice.